Well, good to be here, man. It's this last 2 years was just rough. I mean, I enjoy giving talks on Zoom. I'm glad that technology is available, but it's just not the same, you know. And I'll admit, I've been somebody who listens to a lot of talks on Zooms and webinars and things like that, and I'm sure some of you are like this, just like I am, right? You're at home and you're making lunch and you're listening to that really interesting speaker, and then they say, we're going to go into breakout rooms. You're like, nope, nope, nope. This was supposed to be a passive experience. But anyway, I mean, the energy in person is just different. And one of the reasons why I like to actually travel physically to the campuses is because I learn too, right? I really truly believe that every educational experience has its own context. And while FIU is what it is, URI is what it is, UNT is what it is, right? And the kinds of questions that you're trying to answer here in terms of academic excellence is very unique. It's similar to other places, but it's also unique to UNT. And I get to learn about some of that uniqueness when I talk to you. So for those of you who had the pleasure of conversations all day today, I really truly enjoyed it and learned a lot. So thank you so much. As Dr. Padilla just sort of implicitly implied, I'm a little bit of a mutt, right? I come from a science background. I got into science education research, and I built a program over the last 7.5 years that just brings in a lot of different things. And I'm hoping over the next hour, what we talk about and what I'm able to describe to you is fidelity to a question about equity, as opposed to somebody who felt like because you're a faculty member, you have to do X, Y, and Z, or else they will punish you. And such decisions necessarily come with some risk. I get that. But the equity question is just far too important to ignore it. I'm unable to start. Sorry, fine. I'm unable to tell the story of inclusive teaching without telling you a little bit about my journey. I've never really been good at there's Professor Bryan and there's home Bryan. No, it's just Bryan, right? When you see me on the volleyball court or the salsa floor or, happy hour at the beer garden, I'm the same person when I walk into intro bio or my research lab. And maybe it might be a little different if I, discovered a new protein and I came here to tell you how cool that protein folded and all of that stuff. Maybe this would have been a different kind of talk. But to the extent that education is about the human experience and understanding that and how to inspire and motivate, I am very much a part of that. What you're looking at is, well, Bryan when his hair was in a different part of his head. I think I was about 4 years old in that picture. And you're looking at a bench that's in the middle of the campus of Morehouse College, my undergraduate alma mater. It's still there. I know because I was there 3 months ago and saw it. A 19-year-old Bryan arrived on the shores of America in August 12th, 1999. A first-generation college student intending to pursue a degree in biology with a minor in environmental studies. And a lot of people ask me that, well, did you go to Morehouse because historically Black college and all the history and Martin Luther King went there? I was like, nah, man, they give me a full ride. Like, what? It was free. Like, what? I was coming from a different country, right? What we were looking for was that line that said $0 owed, right? Because with the exchange rate, there was no paying tuition. That was an option that was not on the table, right? So people like, I think St. Lawrence University and Pace University gave me half off. Half off is like nothing off. It's like, there's nothing else to talk about here, right? So Morehouse College, thank God, man, tuition room and board for 4 years. I'm forever grateful for that. And my parents came with me And they stayed for the entire orientation week, which is something I found out later that first generation parents do, but nobody else does. And at the end of the week, they sat me down on that bench and they said, Bryan, we've taken you as far as we could take you. Everything else from this point is up to you. Good luck. And I didn't really get what they meant by that, right? And I want to pause on this slide a little bit because I think the context bears explaining. Many of you all, especially those of you who are first generation like I am, probably have had this experience where your parents tell you stuff differently when you're a teenager versus when you are 30-something. And to some extent, they almost shield you from the realities of their own experience until they feel you are at an age where you can handle that conversation. So I knew I was first generation. And I knew my dad came from a very, very poor family. I didn't know how poor, right? I didn't realize there were 14 siblings and 6 dads. Do the math. I didn't realize there were long stretches of homelessness and hunger that resulted in serious issues. And it's later in life, especially last month or so, because my dad passed away on New Year's Eve last year, just really reflecting on somebody who grew up in that environment and what it takes to see a child go on to college, alone college, let alone get 2 more degrees after that. What that feeling is like. So when I graduated from Morehouse and tears were shed, I was 23 at the time. It seemed kind of over the top, but I get it now, right? I get it now. So sitting on that bench, when your last formal education was 2 years before high school was over, there's no real capital they could provide to me to navigate Morehouse College successfully. They can give me their love and support, which they did. But when I was at the end of my sophomore year, and I ran into organic chemistry and physics, and I saw that C- coming down the pipeline, and I sat in my dorm room and I did the math. Right? I mean, you're undergrad, you do it too, right? C equal 2.0, you put that into the equation of your current GPA, and you add up all the credits and you divide, and you know you have to have a minimum GPA to keep that scholarship. And then you see that figure is 0.01 GPA points below the figure you're supposed to have. And then you start to tremble violently because you know you are going to have to pick that phone up and call your parents and say, sorry, I let you down. And so even though I don't do this in my classes today, thank God my physics 2 teacher curved that grade. Thank God. That C plus probably was a D. To be honest, it probably was a D. And eventually, I found the courage to have the conversation. Like, I didn't tell them how bad it was, but I did let them know, like, it's kind of struggling, right? And I remember my mom said, well, you gave it a shot, you can come home. See, I have 2 sons. They're 8 and 5 right now. You best believe, from the moment they step foot on a college campus, you're going to find the professors who do research. You would have read a book on metacognition. You would have probably done the whole first year syllabus with me before you even go to college. See, I have that privilege, I have that capital, and they will walk in with all of that, right? So when you sit me on a bench and you say, I've taken you as far as I can, that means that all of the navigational capital that they had got used up at that point. And, unfortunately, I know a lot of people who weren't so lucky, who were first generation as well, and didn't have the pleasure of a physics teacher who curved, or some other interventionist, and after that experience, my ecology professor kind of took me under his wing, and I worked in his lab, and my entire academic experience changed from that point because I had an actual mentor who believed in me as an individual, right? And held me accountable in a different way. And he saw that I had potential, but I needed somebody to guide and structure my moves more, right? So I mean, these last 2 years of Morehouse was like a 3.9 or whatever because of that. And it reinforced in my own mind how much education is about people and relationships. I've had the pleasure of having this conversation in many, many different places, right? And I know there are different ways to have this conversation. And I want us to maybe be mindful of what the goals we have set for ourselves are, right? It would be a great day if all of the students who come through UNT, who come through FIU, right, leave these classrooms and leave these universities with a sense of purpose, a sense that they can contribute to society and be civically engaged and shape the powers or hold powers that be accountable. For that to happen, we have to be a little bit clearer on how we identify what the issues are. 15 years ago, it was all about the unprepared students. They didn't study enough. They came in from the worst high schools, blah, blah, blah. If you got a C, it's because you didn't do enough work. Then the active learning mafia came along and said, no, it's all you faculty who don't know what you're doing, and you need to change, and you need, And I do active learning, right? I joke mafia, but sometimes it felt like that. But here's the view I take, right? I have yet to meet the student who gets up in the morning and says, I just paid $28,000 in tuition. Let me see how many Fs I can gather in the next 15 weeks. I'm aware that some students do that gathering and it may feel that way, but I actually don't think when they get up, that's the goal. I also, in spite of some of the things you might see out there, most of the faculty that I meet are not asking themselves how few people I can get to like chemistry or math or bio. How many of you all can I make fail and have to withdraw yourself from this university? I dare say, I believe in the better angels of our nature. I actually believe that deep down, even though sometimes it may not look that way, that both of these stakeholders actually want the best out of this situation. So if you're willing to be naive with me and believe that, then the question becomes, how do you design a system around them that enables them to be their best selves? So you move away from trying to find that straw person to blame for these outcomes and thinking more about systemic design. So what do you want? You want a student to walk on that campus and walk in that classroom and feel like, yes, I too can become a chemist. I too can become a biologist. This is not a question in my mind. I don't have to prove anything to anybody that this is an accessible career for me, right? I'm here to get the skills, but I very much can be that because I can see examples of that, right? I see people who believe in me. I know my instructor has my back, right? Like I mean, I love Morehouse. This is not even a super critique of it, but I got to look to the left, look to the right speech. Right, I remember at 19, like in the freshman orientation, look to your left, look to your right, one of you will not be there. And you know what? They were right. The next year, one of us certainly would. And I remember even then thinking, how is that a good business model? Like, why would you set your operations up so people can't stay? Like, it just doesn't make any sense at all. So One of the classes I teach is intro bio, and I'll talk about that in a second. I flipped that on his head. First day of class, I said, look to your left, look to your right. You will open a business with that person one day. That person will become your study partner for this course. That person will be your roommate next year because you're connecting a different level. That person will be a doctor in 10 or 15 years. That person will become a professor, but maybe they might change professions. We will all get where we need to go. Your time with us right now for 15 weeks is to develop some skills to get there. We develop it assuming that the light and the brilliance and the enlightenment is there. It's just our job to extract it, right? And then lastly, the student needs to be open to what I call the awakening of the soul. What do I mean by that? Some really interesting work coming out of, I think, Indiana University, J.J. Arnett, 2000 publication, a theory called emerging adults. And the argument he makes is that in westernized societies like ours, a lot of traditionally aged students, between 20 and 30, typically put off things like childbearing, marriage, till their 30s. And so then there becomes this period of life which is not adolescence, but is also not adulthood. And there's a lot of exploration that's happening. There's a lot of figuring out of your identity. There's no one's committing to long-term relationships as much. You switch jobs a lot. So for example, I think 61% of people who come out of the closet, they do so in their freshman year of college, right? So there's some psychology behind what that time period means for them, right? So I am not interested in you coming to campus with all of the sacred cows that you grew up believing. I'm not saying that everything you believed is a lie, but I'm saying that campus and by extension, the classroom is a place where that can be respectfully interrogated. I mean that I went to Morehouse College having written essays, my friends, on why gay marriage should be illegal. And I learned a lot about myself and about opening my mind in that time period. And I would argue to you that that was as important a lesson for me and my growth as anything in the Krebs cycle. And I don't remember any enzyme in the Krebs cycle, just FYI. So technically that was more important because the other one I forgot. Instructors then need to be the kinds of instructors who see beyond content. The second bullet point is actually a quote from Elizabeth Mohay. It's a paper. You could actually just Google that. Teach students, not subjects. I teach students, not subjects. It is not to say that content matter and subject matter is not important in a classroom. It is to say that that is only a part of the educational experience. There's a history to this. So after World War II, when US professors went to Germany and fell in love with the Humboldtian model of higher ed, US higher ed became a knowledge production machine. And so the research professor became sacrosanct, right? They became the stars. And then, the corollary to that is that the normal schools which trained K-12 teachers were considered an unintellectual space. So there was, and still is to a certain extent, a belief that the act of teaching is not a skill to be taught and to be cultivated and to be measured and to be considered as part of a faculty's professional portfolio. It's like, oh, you're the world's expert in that one enzyme. Oh, by the way, could you teach intro bio? It starts Monday. So I mean, it's just a bullet point here, but my friends, there's a real reset. There's a real cultural change that has to happen if we are going to change the culture of what teaching looks like. And in that reset process, we have to bring everything to the table. It's not just a matter of, we have a workshop, we're bringing a speaker from FIU, you'll come and you'll enjoy him. We're going to have a book group where we read a book on inclusive teaching. We have to ask, why do we pay lecturers $30,000 less than research faculty? Especially when the economics of the institution are such that tuition is actually what keeps our doors open. How do we evaluate teaching in somebody's portfolio when they go out for promotion? Is it actually evaluated? Or is it, oh, so you taught the class and no one died, so good. How do we support the professional development of faculty? So in other words, would it not be a beautiful thing that the same amount of resources and robustness that is typically attached to an Office of Sponsored Research be similarly attached to a Center for Teaching and Learning? We have to stop this sort of revolutionary margins thing. Because quite frankly, many people I meet, and I'm sure many, if not all of you in this room, they want to do the right thing. Like, no one's sitting up here saying, Bryan, we shouldn't be equitable. Like, we don't have that conversation anymore. The conversation that we need to start having is, how do you structure people to allow them to be their best selves? And that will start involving some hard decisions about hiring, about review, about salary structures, about titles, about job security. We don't have all the time in the world to talk about that now, but we need to know. So today, I want to take us back to the classroom. And I want to structure the rest of our conversation around this diagram. And I wrote this paper now a couple of years ago, and I think I was telling somebody about, it took a while to write it because at the time in my community, the STEM education research community, we were still in the best practices phase, I call it, right? Bryan, can you tell us the 5 things so I could be inclusive on Monday? No, man, like this doesn't work like that. I just needed tips. I'm like, I don't deal in that yet, right? I get that at some point when Monday morning comes and class begins, there are specific things you have to do. I'm not dismissive of that. But I'm saying that if you try to do those things without context, you could actually make the inequity worse. And we have to be willing. Part of the restructuring is our willingness to go back and learn. Admit that, you know what? I actually don't know the social context of my students. I don't know what it means to teach students. I don't know how the K-12 environment impacts who comes into my classroom. And be willing to put the time in to learn that. So, in this paper, if you do get your hands on it and you go through citations, you will see like, I'm citing Paulo Freire, I'm citing John Dewey, I'm citing, Miles Horton, Ira Shaw. Like, I'm going back in time, man. And I'm trying to message to my audience, we have to step back and do our homework. And that what these scholars have laid out before us for the last century is that until you cultivate the relationships, don't start asking about when you should do interrupted questions and clickers and immediate feedback techniques. Like, figure that out first. Know who you are, know who your students are, have strategies to build that relationship with them, and then design your class around what that relationship is going to look like. So what I'm going to do is walk you through that process in the context of, which I have to admit is my favorite class. And I'm doing it for a couple of reasons. Number one, hopefully you'll hear some things that I talk about that you might find interesting, consider for your own context. But what I hope to leave you with is more the process, right? That kind of very careful work that happens every summer for me, every pre-class period, to think about what it will mean to inspire and motivate this class. To me, I know I'm biased, but I really believe Intro Bio is a special class. And I mean, I hate to say it, I don't know if everybody should be teaching it, right? I mean, I think there are some great teachers who, you know, that 400 level class on frog legs, that's your thing. Do that, right? But intro is different. Intro bio to me is more about the intro than the bio. You have to understand all that goes in to a student coming into college, trying to transition into a science environment, and I like to call it trying to learn how to college, while at the same time developing subject matter expertise. So if you're not careful and intentional about your design, you can find that your assessments are actually assessing people's inability to transition successfully than their actual scientific ability. And in order to understand that, back to my last slide, you have to be able to do your research. So I will start a little bit with me just to give you a bit more context. I got a chance to write about this a few years ago, and it was really a good reflective experience, because I think the older you get, the more you process and reprocess how your own life experience, the experience of your parents and your community, how it's impacted your current practice, sometimes in ways that even you don't realize until you go through this reflection process. One anecdote here is that my deceased father was a pastor, a Baptist pastor, and you know, I don't practice anymore. Don't tell my parents that. But I've realized that how much of how I view my classroom was influenced by that. I don't pick up collection. I mean, I'm tempted on some days, but we need more clickers. So just, my dad was very insistent on using the term pastor as opposed to, say, minister or priest or reverend even. Because the term pastor comes from pastoral farming, which is shepherds who take care of sheep. And the understanding around using that word in the ministerial context is that you were responsible for your sheep. When you took them out to pasture, when you took them out to graze, and you came back, right? Because it wasn't a static thing, like you had to actually go somewhere and then come back, find new pastures or whatever, right? You had to ensure that everybody came back intact. Like if you left with 20, you came back with 20. So in the Christian context, it was about salvation, but in the intro bio context, it's the acceptance that your social and academic growth over the next 15 weeks is a responsibility that I take on, right? You have responsibilities too, I get that. I'm not absolving you of that. But I would argue I have perhaps an even bigger one because of the experience that I have, right? So I'm just as nervous as they are on every exam, right? I mean, the work, you know, you sort of put into get to know each person individually, you know, it's really hard work. And the enrollment for this class, by the way, is 155. It's a, you know, I mean, I know they're bigger classes, but it's not a small class. So some people would ask about, you know, things like, you know, do you take attendance? How do you get them to come to class? Here's the challenge. Can you design a classroom where a student gets up in the morning and says, I want to be there? I know by going to this class, there's value added to my educational experience. So we take attendance just to know how many people show up. But there's no points, there's no deduction if you don't come. Your tuition dollars, you make that decision. But we average 97% attendance. because we make sure they understand why that's valuable. And I'll show you in a second how we do that. The second point, and if you kind of think back to the model, you know, there's self and then there's empathy. There's two levels to empathy in this context. One is what I call macro empathy, and the other is micro. And when I say macro, what I mean is the broader social forces that influence and impact students' day-to-day experience is very important to understand how they walk into your classroom. You know, Diane Ravitch, a K-12 scholar from NYU, has a book called Reign of Error. Wonderful book. And she says in the introduction, you can't begin to talk about school improvement until you talk about healthcare in low-income communities, prenatal diets, universal child. You don't even get to my school until you start talking about my community, right? And that is part of my point here. What you're looking at, in case you don't know, is a redlining map. These maps were drawn in the 1930s by a group called the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And how it worked was the federal government was trying to get citizens back up on their financial feet after the Depression, and you would get low or no interest loans depending on where you fell on that map. So if you were in the blue or green zone, you were good. If you were in the yellow zone, that neighborhood was considered declining. In the case of Providence, Rhode Island, that was mostly Jewish and Italian immigrants. If you were in the red zone, which is where the term redlining comes from, you were either denied loans outright or you may get them at really high interest rates, and that's mostly where Blacks and Hispanics and some other Eastern European immigrants lived. That was more or less policy until the Fair Housing Act of 1968. And then, of course, as these things go, even when a law gets passed, it doesn't mean that tomorrow everybody's going to act right. So you have to understand that and I've said this a few times in meetings today, we live in a capitalist society. That's what it is. I'm not even critiquing capitalism here. I'm just saying this is what it is, right? And part of that economic model is that you build generational equity through home ownership. So with this policy, you are denying generations of people opportunities to build wealth. So in a case where a local bank was accused of redlining, they settled out of court and wouldn't admit wrongdoing, but would pay the settlement. This was 8 years ago. This began in the 1930s, right? I know some of you are sitting here, maybe on Zoom, and thinking, when we're just talking about intro bio, how do we get here? See, my intro bio class was mostly kids from Rhode Island, and most of them were from Providence. So when they walk into that room having not taken a science class since their freshman year of high school, or they took a science class with no equipment, I'm not going to hold them accountable for systemic structures over which they had no control. I'm being very careful here. I'm not deficitizing them. I'm not saying that, ooh, you came from a poor school and therefore you can't do my, no, not that. It helps me to be aware of from whence they came. So at the very least, I can't catch myself at any point, kids from this school just don't do well in my, no. this school is located on this street, and I understand what those teachers are going through. I understand how the property tax in this state works. I understand which PTA has a $5 million endowment. I get all of that. So I can't solve 100 years of redlining with an intro bio class. But I can definitely help students who come from those neighborhoods and those schools to be in a space where they could still believe that science is something that's accessible to them. That's how you think about the macro level. Yes, I have other projects in my life, my research lab, programming, where I work with high schools, I work with the school districts. Yes, I have resources and privilege to do that. But as a teacher in the classroom, that's the mindset, right? So on a micro level, I want to get to know who they are as people, right? Everybody gets a student ID number, I get that, and you get the roster and random number generator, blah, blah, blah. But now I want to know who you are. So there's a couple of things that happens. One is I use something called the first day info sheets. That's the citation. If you just Google Scholar that, it should pop up. And you'll see on there a list of, very simple questions, right? What pronouns you use? What do you love about science? Very asset-based type questions. Describe one thing your teacher does that you love. Describe one thing that you don't like. Describe one thing that you're good at, right? And they really write some funny stuff, to be honest. And it's very helpful because even though I have a large class, very often I have the privilege of talking to them individually. And by having this data, like when they're coming, I could kind of go back and take a look and sort of remind myself of things that the students said about themselves. That is then followed up by the NPR assignment. And honestly, when I started doing that, it was just, I was doing this as a grad student with classes that I TA, and it was just because at that time, I listened to NPR way too much, and then, yeah, too depressing now, so I don't. But, and I still love it, I still support them, but I love this particular program, right? And so I would assign this before they show up, like it's due on the first day of class. And first day of class is Wednesday, and on Thursday, I would clear my schedule and read every single one. And I have to tell you, man, I've been talking about this assignment now for about 3 years. And I feel like talking to faculty about this assignment is like talking to undergrads about study abroad. They generally believe me, and they don't disagree, but they don't realize how transformative it is until they go to Costa Rica. And then when they come back, it's like, wow, I'm like a whole new person, right? And so there's the same with this. Like, I'm sure some of you all even know the program, but I promise you, when you start seeing those essays and what they start talking about, there's no way you could go back to seeing your students as just UNT ID number 001100. I was in New England. They were talking about, and at the height of the opioid epidemic, they were talking about burying parents from overdose. They would talk about being children of divorcees. They would talk about what their dog means to them. They would talk about, Sunday dinner in Italian families and what that's like. I mean, it's so beautiful. But then they would also give you clues as to what their mindset is. So, I would read things like, I really love science, but I'm not a math person. What you're saying is that you haven't had good experiences in math so far. So now my job as a practitioner is to figure out how to get you those valuable experiences that demonstrates you some task value, because that is what your brain will refer to that tells you you can go on and do more complicated things. See, if I don't get the mind right, it doesn't matter how much I flip the classroom. So much of the first few weeks of the class is just getting, especially my first generation students and the ones who come from kind of low resource situations, is to just believe, trust me, you can do it, but you have to trust the process, right? And so it's not just the first day of class speech and then the info sheets and the essays, it's how I follow up with dialogue. And this is important to say because so many of us teach high enrollment classes, and you might be thinking, like, when am I going to get time to talk to 155 students? I don't. I mean, I get to talk to a lot of them, but I don't get time to talk to all of them. But what, my friend, is dialogue? Does it necessarily have to mean that we are one-on-one in my office for 45 minutes? Can't it also be the emails we exchange over a topic? Can't it also be when I walk around campus and I walk into you on the quad, and instead of just a simple hi, I ask you, oh, how are your other classes going? Or how did today's class go? What about the students who come up to you before class while you're setting up your PowerPoint? What about the students who come after? You see, every interaction, this is back to the whole, I teach students and not subjects. If your mindset is I teach subjects, then class is Monday, Wednesday, Friday from 2 to 2:50, and that's it. If I teach students, every single interaction I have with a student is an opportunity for education to happen. So I've run into students who've, years after they've graduated, they've gone on to other classes, and they would say things like, you know, Bryan, that thing you said in class about career choice or whatever just really changed my mindset. I don't know what I said, but they remember. And that's what matters. So, as you could tell, this class is a lot of moving parts. And, you know, some people ask, well, you know, what kind of style of teaching you have? Or I was like, we don't label it. Like, you know, depends on the day you come, depends on the learning outcomes. You know, we build things around that. But certainly there are a few things that kind of bubble to the top here I want to share with you that's reflective of our style and the importance we place on relationships. One is the need to build agency. The rigor is not dropped. We don't make the class easy. We don't dumb anything down. We don't make it less difficult. What we do is we increase the support structures so everyone has an opportunity to be successful at a pace that's comfortable for them. But at the end of the day, everyone's held accountable to that. See, my lovely students are the world's greatest nodders. You know them. You're explaining glycolysis, right? One molecule splits into 2 pyruvate, and everybody get it? All right, can you explain it back to me? So they will, you know, and I've had this experience in my office, right? And I would say to them, I'm not going to examine you on how well you could agree with me. I'm going to examine you on how well you can articulate a concept. So unless you can go to a whiteboard or to a friend and explain this and be confident that you are correct and can field questions on it, consider that you don't know it yet, right? So all the exams are short answer. We don't do multiple choice. They're all short answer. So you spend a lot of time in class, right? You know, going back and forth about how to explain something, you know, critiquing each other's short answers. They're all application questions. And, you know, I'm not against multiple choice, but I certainly know that I have some students who can ABCD their way to a grade and not necessarily actually know biology in 15 weeks, right? Or not be able to explain the things that I think are important by that time, right? And one of the reasons why this is important to me, or I think is important in general, is just because Bryan shows up with a shirt and a tie and dress shoes, it doesn't mean you don't get to critique or ask me questions, right? Just because, you know, things come across cable news or somebody's a politician, like you have the agency to question things that are being told. And you develop that agency through the process of understanding your own capacity for knowing. right? So it's not just that Bryan stood in front and said, these are complementary base pairs and they're hydrogen bonds in the middle. No, it's because you actually understand why that matters through an energy perspective. And when you do it that way, then you get curious about, well, why doesn't that energy change in different cell structures or whatever? That's the stuff that drives you to ask more questions. So it's not because Bryan said it or because the textbook with 900 pages makes it look nice and glossy, right? It's because you understand it for yourself. Secondly, we want to cultivate respect for humanity. And this is something that I think tends to be missing from the diversity conversation, because a lot of times the DEI stuff stops at how many Black and brown people can get on slides. And while I'm happy we made it to the slide deck, I think we have to kind of go beyond that and be very clear on what our goals are here. If 20 years from now, you need to invite Bryan Dewsbury to come back and talk about why inclusion is important, we have a problem, right? Like if we weren't able to make progress in that time period, right? We have to look in the mirror and say, what did we miss? So part of it is, yes, do include the voices of your students. Do make sure that they see that scientists are diverse and all of us are capable of doing great things. But also, when your students go on to become scientists or employees or managers or bosses of different types, they need to have the skills to work with people who are different to them. So in other words, it's not okay for me to just have my Black and brown students feel included. It's important for me, for my non-marginalized students, to understand a fuller picture of what it means to be a scientific citizen in this country. So everybody learns about the Tuskegee study. I don't put it in there just so that the students of color can feel included. I do it because everybody needs to talk about it. So when we put them in groups, it's not just get into groups because group work works and everybody's grade will go up by like 0.2%. No. Group work is an opportunity for dialogue. So when I create groups, they are mixed. They're mixed by generational status. And the assignments I give them are group assignments. They write group essays. For example, DNA structure, right? Big discovery, double helix. But they talk about Maurice Wilkins and his theft of Rosalind Franklin's data. And they talk about women in science, right? And they write viewpoints on each, and they have to present a consensus viewpoint. And because I'm asking them to do that, that means I have to teach them how to do difficult dialogues. So the first 2 days of class, we talk about that. Somebody next to you will have a very different view and may or may not say things that you strongly disagree with, maybe even to the point where you may feel an emotional reaction coming. Let's talk about how you deal with that. Because what I don't want to do is to outsource the DEI question to the MLK breakfast. I don't want to wait until Hispanic Heritage Month to say, we here care about diversity. I don't want to wait until the International Food Potluck. Please still have it. Those are great. But that's not how you address diversity at an institutional level. You address behaviors, and you can formatively develop this in your science classroom. It's not just the Black and brown sides. Lastly, I want them to have a really full picture of science. And I want to be careful here, because sometimes this ends up in a slippery slope of you're trying to tell them how bad science is and how evil, white America has been. And no, it's not that. I mean, we got our COVID vaccine in like 2 days, right? So, I mean, clearly I love science. Like, please, there are diseases you never heard about because of science. So we spent a good amount of time making that point very clearly, right? But we also, in the interest of full transparency, want to talk about the times where science was parts of the problem. And not so much science as like science itself, but to the extent that science is done by human beings, and human beings bring their own biases and experiences to the table, it stands to reason that the types of questions that are asked, the ways in which data is collected, the ways in which data is interpreted, and the types of conclusions that are drawn are going to be impacted by those biases. It was scientists who signed off on Latinos being sterilized in California and North Carolina. It was scientists who deliberately infected men in Tuskegee with syphilis. It was scientists who supported the American Breeders Association. It was scientists who only studied male songbirds for like 20 years until a female scientist like, did you check on the other? Huh. Yeah, we didn't. I don't know why, but. So it's again, it's not to, this is just all doom and gloom. This is, if you're going to go on to do this, I want to make sure you understand both the capacities, but also some of the challenges associated with being a human being in this space. So when you go on to run your own lab, right, the hope is that you can make different decisions. So we brought this whole model to URI, and in these situations, you usually have to kind of, what people want to hear is, did you close the achievement gap? A term which I struggle with. Okay, hate. So yeah, like we wiped that out, right? It was 35% failure rate when I got there on average. Our section reduced that to, I think, 9%. And a big part of that was we cut 40% of the content. 40% of the content had to be cut so we can focus on teaching students. And we can talk a little bit in the Q&A on what went into that decision, on like what we cut and how we made that choice, but we cut 40%. And so one of the things that happened was what I like to call the Statue of Liberty effect, which I haven't been to, but I know it has an inscription that says, bring me your poor, your marginalized, your bad spellers, don't read the textbook. So what it looks like in a higher ed context is, I don't know if this student is ready for bio, but let's send them to Bryan's section because he's doing that in magic. Not magic. Because see, what makes it worse is, my class was like 19-20% underrepresented students. It went up to about 55-60%. And the reason why I want you to kind of understand this slide is because many times what institutions do is when they find that one class with that weird teacher who's doing all this stuff, instead of asking, what can we learn from that person that could be scaled? We say, how do we force more students into that situation so that hero person could change everything? And what makes it even worse is that if that happens to be a person of color, and then they end up with all these sort of unofficial mentoring that, oh, by the way, we're not going to really take seriously when you go up for review, knowing that you're doing all this additional labor, that's when you get into questions about how do you retain faculty. The other critique was, well, Bryan, if you cut 40% of the content, clearly they're going to do better because they have less to study. Not true, but that's what's said. And furthermore, Bryan, you are being unethical because you're setting them up for failure. Like when they go on to Gen Bio 2 and genetics and ecology, like they'll just fall flat in their face. So we said, let's look at that. We looked at, so let me just paint the picture for you real quick. There are 4 sections of intro bio in the first semester. I'm teaching one of them, and there are two sections of the second semester, and one person teaching one of those sections teaches very much like what I just described. So if you are an undergraduate student, you can end up in the 200 level class in your sophomore year, first semester, haven't gone through one of 4 pathways. You could either have a full year of non-inclusive teaching, pathway 1, 1 semester of it, and then second semester inclusive teaching, pathway 2. First semester of inclusive teaching, second semester not, pathway 3, or a full year of it. And what we looked at were the grades of the students in the 200 level class in that sophomore year. So BS is initials, by the way, just so you know. Those are the students are in the full year of inclusion. Let me remind you that they had 40% less content than all the other categories. In fact, C is the group who had a full year of non-inclusive teaching. Even if those points were the exact same height, I can tell you what, we covered 40% less and they did just as well as you. They're actually doing better. So here's the thing. We always had the mentality that there's so much beautiful things to learn in biology. So much, like, and some of that information is changing and it's evolving, and why am I stressing myself out to cover every little granular detail this textbook has written down? Even in a 4-year degree, there's really only so much. If you really want to get to the coverage thing, there's only so much we could talk about. My best shot at keeping you engaged in this is to teach you how to become a self-regulated learner. If I demonstrate to you, as I talked about, being disciplined about you only know something if you can explain it to your roommate, that's a skill you will take when Bryan's not around. Because I fully believe, as I've shown, that half of that stuff, you don't need me to talk about it. Like half of that stuff, you can actually do it on your own. You don't know that yet, but by the end of the semester, you will. And so I know we live in a climate of, you get these 900 pages and there's this feeling like you have to touch on all of it and all. And I'm not dismissive of content. We cover, I think, still a good amount of it. But that's not the goal. The coverage is not the goal. So I'll close by really asking you all to think about, what do you want your students to become? 20 years ago, the question was all about what do we want students to know? And then, with active learning is what do we want them to do? And I think those things are still somewhat relevant. But to me, the question of inclusion is a question of who do we want our students to be? What kinds of conversations we want them to have? What kind of society we want them to be a part of? What kind of values that they will take with them when they leave UNT? And that question, to answer that question, we can't just be good at chemistry, right? We can't just be good at biology and math, right? We have to spend some time understanding what it means to cultivate values. And this is not I don't want anyone feeling dwarfed by the enormity of the task, because as I've said earlier, I do believe in people's better angels. I do believe that quite honestly, 99% of the faculty I've met, want to be part of the solution. And I understand that, when a Bryan comes along and brings this kind of stuff up, the question might be where to start. And there are pathways for that. But I do want you to feel empowered that this is in fact a pathway you can be a part of. I was a marine science grad student, right? I had great times in Florida doing 6,000 plus dives, and that was sort of the trajectory. And I walked into a classroom in the first semester of my PhD and I realized this is a road to Damascus moment. I couldn't go back to the boat. I mean, the boat was fine, it was fun. But I taught a bunch of first generation Cuban American students who, when you talk to them and ask them what it meant to be educated and why pursuing pre-med mattered and what they were hoping to get out of the experience that faculty weren't ready to provide, teaching and science education became a calling. And the difference between a calling and a job, my friends, is that a job is something you do. And people do it well, I get it. A calling is something you respond to. And you don't respond to it once, you respond to it every day of your life with everything you do in that space. So, I mean, I've read the books, I've done workshops, and I've tried to do my best to be educated about what this means, but sometimes we overcomplicate this, right? Sometimes we want to, what's the first book to read? Many times, your best and most important data set is sitting right in front of you. I want to thank you for your attention. We have a little bit of time for some questions, but if we don't happen to get a chance to talk to each other today, this is where you find me. And I know, perhaps unlike other talks, hopefully some of this will sit with you for a while. And in doing so, 2 weeks from now, a question might pop up and email me. Some of my best collaborations have come through that, where it was just a follow-up thing about their class. And I really do encourage it, because it's a conversation we need to have, and it's a journey I really I'm proud and to be able to support people on, including yourself. So thank you so much.